Actually Speaking, Episode 7, Frequently Asked Questions, or, as I like to call it, Factually Speaking. Want to know how to live skeptically and still have friends? So do I. Let's figure it out. Actually Speaking, a podcast that explores the human side of skepticism, critical thinking, and the skills we need to make it through the day. Hi everyone, and welcome to Episode 7 of Actually Speaking, a podcast that sets the science aside and explores the human side of skepticism. My name is Mike Meraz, and today we're going to take a break from our usual episode topics. Instead, I'm going to answer some of the more frequently asked questions I receive from all of you. First of all, let me say thank you for all the support and positive feedback I've received for the podcast. I get a lot of email from listeners, and all of it is overwhelmingly positive. So whether it's an email, tweet, or iTunes review, I really appreciate the support the community has shown. I know I've said it before, but I had my doubts when I started this podcast, whether or not there would be an audience for this particular topic. It's not as sexy as paranormal debunking or as energized as religious controversies. We're talking about interpersonal communication, social skills, and improving relationships with people who think differently. Those aren't traditionally eye-catching or sexy topics. But based on your feedback, those doubts were definitely unfounded, and thank you for pointing that out so clearly. So please, keep the feedback coming. You can send emails to actuallyspeaking@gmail.com or interact with me directly via Twitter at twitter.com/factually. That's with an F. Now, speaking of iTunes, thank you to Double Helical and Patrick146, who left reviews for the podcast. They were very, very kind and generous in their support of the show. But I do need to make one correction. In one of the reviews, I was referred to as Dr. Meraz. Now, I have to admit, I loved the sound of that. But in fairness, I need to clarify that I don't actually have a doctoral degree and haven't earned that title, at least not yet. And until then, I wouldn't want to suggest an inaccurate level of expertise on my part. So, if the listener who left that review could make that minor correction, I'd really appreciate it. Thank you. Of course, any additional iTunes reviews or ratings any of you might care to make are always appreciated. It's really a helpful way of showing support for the show while also helping to promote it. So, thank you in advance. Okay, let's move on to some of your questions. One of the most common requests I get is for advice on specific personal situations. Now, I'm not going to share those emails here for obvious reasons, but these emails usually take me a bit longer to respond to, so please be patient with me if there's ever a delay. But I do respond to each email, and I've really enjoyed the conversations that have resulted. Now, while the podcast isn't an advice column, I certainly don't mind talking with listeners privately outside the show, so please feel free to write. But I do have a couple of things to point out from these particular types of emails. The first is that I'm learning that you want more examples of how to apply the skills discussed in the podcast to real-life situations. I think that's a great idea, and I'm making plans to do just that in future episodes. I've got about 2 to 3 episodes already planned, but beyond that, we can certainly dive into more examples, which might even encompass multiple skills. Practice is definitely important, and your emails are really helpful in showing me the types of examples that you'd like to see. The second point is actually more of a clarification. The target audience for the skills in this podcast is sometimes confused when people write in. The podcast deals primarily with the skills needed to interact effectively with people in our daily life, people with which you already have an existing relationship, family, and friends. Now, these skills are applicable to people outside your social circles, but that's not always our intended audience for the podcast. I often get requests for advice on interacting with public figures, organizations, businesses, resources, movements, and things like that. Now, all of these benefit from civil discourse, but they can be very different entities from family and friends. And it's not my intent for the podcast to delve into that more political territory. It doesn't mean that we won't in the future, but for now, I want to stick with the area that I know best, which is interpersonal communication and the intended audience of family and friends. Now, this is actually where the diversity in our skeptic community comes into play, because we need members with the skills and expertise to aggressively engage those public figures, structures, and organizations that are consciously spreading misinformation. And we have some very capable people that are doing just that. But there also needs to be a part of the skeptic community that focuses on outreach and education. That's where this podcast primarily fits in. By educating people effectively, we starve out the sources of misinformation from potential recruits. It's a two-pronged approach where multiple areas of expertise within the community are needed. Both activism and education are going to be needed for change. This podcast focuses primarily on education. So, expect more situational examples and practice in the future, and when writing in for advice, please understand why I'll try not to stray too far from my area of expertise, which I think is good advice for all of us. Justin writes, "Hey Mike, love the podcast and the fact that you're local to the LA area. Do you do any public speaking engagements or presentations?" Thank you, Justin. It's actually been nice joining the chorus of Southern California skeptics. And we're pretty lucky to have people like Brian Dunning of Skeptoid.com and Michael Shermer of Skeptic Magazine in the neighborhood as well. I do a lot of public speaking professionally. Unfortunately, nothing related to skepticism or this podcast, at least not yet. So far, I've just been focusing on getting the podcast going, which is actually more time consuming than people realize. But I have started reaching out, and I'm joining local organizations, and I do intend to make myself available as a speaker. So stay tuned, and I'll be sure to announce anything that develops either here or on the website. Of course, if you have anything specific in mind, please feel free to email me. On a similar note, Adele writes, in part, "Will you be attending any conferences this year?" Yep. I'll be at TAM 8 this July. For those that don't know, TAM is the amazing meeting held in Las Vegas each summer by the James Randi Educational Foundation. As a gift, my wife sent me to TAM 7 last year, and I loved it. I got to meet so many people from all the podcasts and blogs that you're probably already subscribed to, and I highly recommend it for anyone that has the means to attend. In fact, this is kind of interesting. TAM 7 last summer is where I met Desiree Schell, the host of Skeptically Speaking radio show and podcast. Now, that chance encounter and an act of pure kindness on her part was actually what set in motion the chain of events that led to the Actually Speaking podcast. So, good things come from TAM, and I owe Des a big public thank you. Be sure to check out her show at skepticallyspeaking.com if you want to see a perfect balance of activism, education, and resources all in one weekly package. She and the people that work on the show with her are amazing. I had hoped to attend DragonCon in Atlanta this September. I know many of you had asked, but I can't make the scheduling work for that one, so I'm going to have to miss it. But if anyone is going to be at TAM this summer, please keep an eye out for me because I would love to meet you. Another email I get quite often are actually references to sites and podcasts who, well, let's just say aren't engaging in the most civil manner with the public. These aren't well-known resources. None of those shared were even on my radar, but they don't necessarily have insignificant followings either. I understand the frustration as you're trying to learn how to be the best advocate you can be for skepticism and critical thinking when you see other sites and people and resources that are doing things in not the most positive way. You know, people are just at different places on their skeptical growth curve. There's a lot of anger out there, and sometimes people need to vent that frustration in order to work through it. It'd be nice if they did it more privately, but these days, anyone can pick up a microphone or start a blog. There isn't much that can be done about an angry or attacking style. I really wish there was, but that doesn't mean there isn't anything we can do. If I find a site that I find offensive, I won't visit it. I won't support it. I might even write in and share my reasonings before moving on. It'd be nice if they changed their approach, but I can't control that, and I don't expect them to. Instead, I'll support things, sites, or resources that are consistent with my notion of effective and positive skepticism and atheism. And I'll promote those the best I can. I'll stick with the things that I can control and support resources that place atheism and skepticism in the most positive and effective light. There really isn't much more that can be done without bringing myself down to a different level. Now, like I said, I understand the frustration and I understand why people are sending in some of these links, and I appreciate it. I enjoy actually seeing the contrast, and it helps me understand what I can incorporate more into the show. So don't stop doing it. If you find something out there that's really wild or kind of crazy, just send it in. But let me give you a bit of advice when you're sifting through different sites. When you sift through resources, or even just people in general with different styles of communication, it's helpful to keep something in mind. There are two ways in which people can elevate and feel good about themselves. The first is to work hard at putting the time, effort, and energy into things that help us actually grow, become better, and stand out as an example to others. The second way is to take a club and beat down everything and everyone around you so that eventually you feel elevated in comparison. I think you know which approach I support, and I keep that in mind when choosing what sites, resources, and people I stand behind. Another group of emails I get are those that deal with the format of the show. Nothing critical in the least. In fact, very complimenting by asking for more frequent and longer episodes. Well, the 15-minute episodes every other week format isn't likely to change, at least not in the near future. I certainly appreciate the compliment attached to these questions and requests, so thank you very much. But there's a reason for the format. The podcast was always intended to be a supplement to your current Skeptic playlist, something that anyone could throw into their podcast feed without hesitation and would add value to the other shows you listen to. One listener, Double Helical, actually put it nicely in their review. They said, "This is a perfect complement to the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, Skeptoid, Point of Inquiry, and Brain Science podcast." For me, that really sums it up. Plus, I don't know about you, but my podcast playlist is completely full. I'm really reluctant to add an hour of anything at this point. But one listener, Anita, did write in with a tip for new listeners, which I thought was really helpful. She wrote, "Hi, Mike. I've listened to the first 4 episodes and really enjoyed them. Looking forward to the next one. I listened to them one after another, and I think this was the wrong way to do it. Too much information all at once, and I tend to start to tune it out. I suggest including a suggestion in your next episode for people to listen to the episodes spaced apart, by a couple of days at least, to give them time to mull over the ideas presented." I think this is a really good suggestion, and I completely agree. Thank you very much, Anita. Let's see, what else? Oh, parenting. A lot of you are anxious for parenting topics. Don't worry, we will get there. I'm actually anxious myself. But to hold you over, I do have 2 parenting podcasts to recommend. No, parenting podcasts are a dime a dozen, but skeptic or secular-based parenting podcasts are much harder to find. Fortunately, 2 new ones just launched recently that I'd like to share. The first is called Podcast Beyond Belief, which you can find on iTunes. It's the official podcast of the Foundation Beyond Belief and focuses on parenting and social issues for secular parents. Now, this is a team of hosts from various other blogs and online resources who tackle a variety of parenting news and topics from different perspectives. Colin and his co-hosts, they do a great job producing this. It's been really helpful for me, and I'd highly recommend you add it to your playlist. The second one is Skep Parent, which you can find on iTunes as well, or at skepparent.com. That's with 1 P. This is a husband and wife podcasting team, Tyson and Don, and they felt the same void that we all do in critical thinking-based parenting resources and decided to do something about it. Now, you're going to learn a lot as they share their own parenting challenges, discuss news items, and provide you with ideas for activities to promote science and critical thinking with your own kids. Tyson and Don are really easy to listen to, and it's very comfortable. You're actually going to feel like you're sitting down at the kitchen table with them talking about parenting over coffee. I listen to both and love their approach to the topic of parenting. They're definitely worth your time to check out. While we're on the topic of parenting, I do have a small treat for all of you. My son and I, he's 6, do a lot of science and critical thinking activities whenever we can. But after listening to these 2 parenting podcasts, it actually got me motivated to see if I could do an activity that promoted science communication, something that would plant even the smallest seed of excitement in sharing scientific knowledge. Well, we did our activity this last weekend, and I've attached the result to the end of this podcast. It worked like a charm, and I hope you enjoy it. One last question before we wrap up. This one comes from Dominic and was a question I hadn't received before but thought it was worth sharing. He wrote, in part, any chance of getting a bit of research info, references, or scientific studies in your show? Now, in fairness to Dominic, his email was about something completely different, so this comment is taken a bit out of context. But it resonated with me because I also get a lot of emails which complement the casual, comfortable, and non-research format of the show. And I thought I'd let you know that it's a conscious decision. When I say the podcast is going to set the science aside, that's exactly what I do. Part of my professional life is cultivating and training young scientists on how to present research. And I've organized and attended plenty of research conferences over the years, so it's familiar territory. But you won't find that here, and there's a reason for that. It's my intent to model the communication and interpersonal skills that the podcast advocates. I make every effort to share information with you in the same casual, comfortable, and accessible manner that I hope you are then able to turn around and do with others. And believe me, sometimes it's actually hard to do, but it's important to model the behavior and skills that we want to promote. But keep in mind, podcasts are one-way conversations, so there are limitations. If you have questions or want more information, please just let me know, and I'll try to point you in the right direction. For example, the last episode on challenge and support turned out to be really popular. If you wanted to know more, without diving into full academic research, I'd highly recommend the book Mistakes Were Made by Carol Tavris. Her book discusses the issue of cognitive dissonance in order to explain the complex ways in which people justify irrational beliefs, even in light of compelling contradictory evidence. Or if you don't have time for a book at the moment, then listen to episode 4 of the For Good Reason podcast. DJ Grothy, the host, conducts an interview with Carol on dissonance theory, and she applies it to skepticism and atheism. It's a really good interview and really worth a listen. Okay, that's going to wrap it up for this very first Frequently Asked Question episode of Actually Speaking. Thank you all so much for the feedback that you've sent in since the start of the podcast. I love hearing from you, and I especially enjoy hearing all the stories of how you've applied what you've learned to real-life situations. In the next episode, we're going to look at specific strategies for constructing our speech in order to encourage others to listen and potentially diffuse confrontations before they get started. If you have questions, comments, or would like to share your own tips and ideas on living skeptically, send them to actuallyspeaking@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at twitter.com/FAQtually. Thanks for listening.
Hi, this is Aaron's World, Episode 1. Hi, this is Aaron's World. Today we're going to be learning about Allosaurus. It's a dinosaur. Well, it's a lizard dinosaur that walks on 2 legs and sharp teeth, a long horn, short horns on of its eyes, and a long tail. And it was a theropod. Theropod means it had sharp eyes. Its favorite food was meat. It had a great sense of smell. The tail helped it balance, and it had 2 feet. And that's about theropods. And about Allosaurus, it was a fierce dinosaur that could probably take a bite 100 pounds bigger than a goat. That's probably all I know about Allosaurus, but it had a super long tail and 3 toes. It lived in America during the Jurassic time period. That's it for today. Next time we're going to be learning about Guanodon. Bye!
Actually Speaking, Episode 7, Frequently Asked Questions, or, as I like to call it, Factually Speaking. Want to know how to live skeptically and still have friends? So do I. Let's figure it out. Actually Speaking, a podcast that explores the human side of skepticism, critical thinking, and the skills we need to make it through the day. Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 7 of Actually Speaking, a podcast that sets the science aside and explores the human side of skepticism. My name is Mike Meraz, and today we're going to take a break from our usual episode topics. Instead, I'm going to answer some of the more frequently asked questions I receive. But these emails usually take me a bit longer to respond to, so please be patient with me if there's ever a delay. But I do respond to each email, and I've really enjoyed the conversations that have resulted. Now, while the podcast isn't an advice column, I certainly don't mind talking with listeners privately outside the show, so please feel free to write. But I do have a couple of things to point out from these particular types of emails. The first is that I'm learning that you want more examples of how to apply the skills discussed in the podcast to real-life situations. I think that's a great idea, and I'm making plans to do just that in future episodes. Those doubts were definitely unfounded, and thank you for pointing that out so clearly. So please, keep the feedback coming. You can send emails to actuallyspeaking@gmail.com or interact with me directly via Twitter at twitter.com/FAQtually. That's with an F. Now, speaking of iTunes, thank you to Double Helical and Patrick146, who left reviews for the podcast. They were very, very kind and generous in their support of the show. But I do need to make one correction. In one of the reviews, I was referred to as Dr. Meraz. Now, I have to admit, I loved the sound of that, but in fairness, I see from all of you. First of all, let me say thank you for all the support and positive feedback I've received for the podcast. I get a lot of email from listeners, and all of it is overwhelmingly positive. So whether it's an email, tweet, or iTunes review, I really appreciate the support the community has shown. I know I've said it before, but I had my doubts when I started this podcast, whether or not there would be an audience for this particular topic. It's not as sexy as paranormal debunking or as energized as religious controversies. We're talking about interpersonal communication, social skills, and improving relationships with people who think differently. Those aren't traditionally eye-catching or sexy topics. But based on your feedback, I need to clarify that I don't actually have a doctoral degree and haven't earned that title, at least not yet. And until then, I wouldn't want to suggest an inaccurate level of expertise on my part. So if the listener who left that review could make that minor correction, I'd really appreciate it. Thank you. Of course, any additional iTunes reviews or ratings any of you might care to make are always appreciated. It's really a helpful way of showing support for the show while also helping to promote it. So thank you in advance. Okay, let's move on to some of your questions. One of the most common requests I get is for advice on specific personal situations. Now, I'm not going to share those emails here for obvious reasons,